Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another Java tutorial. And in this tutorial, we are going to be covering classes. Now, this is also the tutorial where I'm going to talk about objects. I referenced them every now and again in the previous tutorials, and I said we're going to learn about them in a later video. Well, this is it. So, first off, I need to explain what exactly an object is and how it relates to a class. Well, an object is essentially something that points to an address in memory, and it will represent it basically represents the same thing that a class represents, which is basically a physical thing, basically a noun of some kind. So a person, place, or thing. So this can be, say, a scanner, or it can be printer. It can be person. It can be an enemy in a game. It can be basically anything. Anything that's a noun. And methods are usually verbs. They're, actions and that kind of thing. And classes contain those methods. And objects are what you use to call those methods from that class. Okay, so that's kind of how they interconnect with each other. Now, of course, as I said, a class, it typically represents an object. Typically, and I don't mean object in the programming context here. I'm saying like a noun or a person, basically a person, place, thing, or even an idea. But enough theory. Let's get into how we actually create a class and how we construct one. So, if we go into our project here, right? So we go into our project. And we say, okay. So what I want to do is we're going to right click here, go to new, and then click on Java class. Now we're going to give this class a name. I'm going to say this is going to be, we're going to call this bird. Make sure we have the public radio button selected and nothing else. Okay? So here's our new class. It's called bird. And this class, inside of these curly braces, there's going to be private properties and methods. So, what are private properties? Well, private properties are certain attributes that describe the class. They're basically adjectives. So this can be what the color of the bird is. This can represent how tall the bird is, how like what the bird's weight is, that kind of thing. So we're gonna put one private property in here for simplicity's sake, and we're gonna say private. Now this is an instance where you would use private because you don't want anything outside this class to access this private property. Hence why it's called a private property, because it's private only to this class. So private, we're going to say color, or to be more specific, feather color. We're going to we're going to say this is a string. So private string feather color. We're going to say the color of this bird's feathers are green. So we have that. That's its default value. You don't have to do this. In fact, what we will do is we will go ahead and not have this, because in most cases, you're not going to define it by default. You can if you want to, but you do not have to. So, the next thing is what's called a constructor. What is a constructor? Well, a constructor is a method that gets called when you create an object for this class. And the constructor is what we typically use to initialize our private properties to default values or values we pass into it. So how does this work? Well, let's type public and then the class name, which is bird. And then we give it opening and closing parentheses and opening and closing curly brackets. Now, when you're creating your constructors, you're either going to have two different constructors typically. One that doesn't contain any parameters and one that contains all the properties. There are certain cases, such as when you're making a game or something like that, where you don't want to have only two constructors. There's instances where you need multiple constructors that take in different parameters. So keep that in mind. The next constructor we're going to make is the one that has all of our private properties in it. So public bird, and then inside of the parentheses here, we're going to say we want to give it a string that will represent the feather color. Okay. So, with these constructors created, this brings us to another concept that we need to understand, and that is the this keyword. Now, what does this mean? Well, the this keyword essentially represents the enclosing object that you're using it in. Now, that's kind of a really odd explanation. What do I mean by the enclosing object? Well, think of it this way. We're inside of a bird class, and that bird class can be used to make an object. So, with that knowledge, this refers to that specific bird object. It refers to this class. It refers to this object. So inside of our constructors, we can go this dot, and then because this refers to this class, this object, we can access all of its properties and its methods. So in this case, we can refer to a feather color, which is our private property up here, and then we can assign it a new value down here equals, we'll give it a default value of green. So now when we create an object of class bird, the feather color will be given a default value of green if we don't pass the constructor anything when we create that object. However, when we go and create an object with parameters, we want to set all the private properties to their associated parameter values that we pass in. So in this case, we only have one private property, which is the feather color, and we have one parameter that is associated with it. So we go this dot feather color, set that equal to feather color. Now this might look a little bit strange to beginners. When you do something like this dot feather color is referring to the private property. We've established this. But you would think that if you also put feather color without this dot in front of it, it would still refer to the private property. But no. This brings in a concept called scope that is very important to understand. Because feather color is also a parameter, and we have this, and we're using, we're referencing it without this dot in front of it, it's going to always go to the local scope first, which is to say it will use the parameter that we pass into the constructor. There's many different types of scopes. There's the global scope, which is the scope that you will use when you assign public static to something, like a public static method or a public static property. That's usually a constant. There's the class scope, or the object scope, where basically, typically your private properties are going to be in that scope. Anything within that class, right, can access that property or method. And then you have your method scope, which basically says that anything within that method can only be accessed by that method and nothing outside of it. However, anything inside a method can access anything within its enclosing scopes. That is why we can still access the private property feather color that is in the class level scope inside of the method scope, because the class is enclosing the method, if that makes sense. If it still doesn't make sense to you, you can always ask questions down in the comments. I'm always willing to answer them, as I've been saying throughout this series. So, with that being said, we also need to create some what are called getter and setter methods. And these will basically assign or get the value of the private properties within your class after you create that object. So in this case, because we only have one property, we only need two methods, one set and one get for this private property. So public void, because we don't want a set method to return anything. Our first method is going to be our set, usually. So we are setters. So when you set something, you don't want to return anything. You only want to assign a value. So public void set feather color, and pass it a feather color, just like that. And inside of this, we just do this dot feather color is equal to feather color, just like that. And then when we go and do public string get feather color, this is to get the value of the private property. As you can see, we are not passing it anything because we're not assigning something. We only need to retrieve that value. So in this case, we go and return feather color. Now, the reason why feather color without this dot in front of it here is referring to the private property is because we're not passing it into the method. And like I explained earlier, anything outside of scopes that are enclosing it, it has access to. So because the private property is inside of the class, and the class has the get feather color inside of it, it can access it because it's outside of its scope, but within the same scope that the method itself is inside of, if that makes sense. Like I said, ask questions if you still don't understand it, but it's fine if you don't. I sure didn't understand it very much when I first started. So that's our entire class constructed. That's it. That's usually what a class looks like when you just want it to represent some kind of object without any functionality. If you want your class to have functionality, like in a game or something, that's a different story. You can still do that. Like if you want, say, your bird to chirp, you can do that. You can have it execute an action, but this is just the basic template for a class, and I'll leave you guys to modify it to your needs. So we will save this. All right. So how do we use a class in our program? Well, how we can do that is, first, let's go ahead and set up a way for the user to enter a value into the console, and then it will assign that value to the private property within our class. Because the best way to kind of demonstrate a real-world example of how these objects are created in real programs, we need to be able to give it input ourselves rather than hard-coding that input. So how do we get the user input first off? Well, first things first is we need to create a scanner object. So scanner is equal to a new scanner. And then inside of that, we pass it system.in. Now we can look at this and say, okay, so we have a class called scanner. It represents a scanner that takes in input, and then we pass it system.in as a parameter, so that way it can actually take in our input. So we need to import it, Control-Shift-O, and you can see, boom, java.util.scanner. Now we're going to go system out print what color is your bird supposed to be? Question mark. And we're going to do a tab escape character. Now, this is where we get the input. So we're going to say string color, because this method to get the input is going to return a string, equals scanner dot next line. So this class scanner has a next line method that goes and says, hey, get the user input here. And then we're going to return that input so the user can assign that to a variable, inevitably. With that, we need to go bird, so the name of the class, we need to name this object. We're going to call this my bird. Set that equal to a new bird. And then as it is right now, no parameters, nothing, the bird's color will be green by default. Because, again, in the empty parameters version of our constructor, we didn't pass it anything. So in that case, we assigned it a default value of green. But in this case, we want to pass it color. So that way now, the bird's color is what the user inputs. Then we can print out whatever the bird's color is by going system out println and say your bird's color is, and then my bird dot, and then we call the get feather color method. Just like that. Pretty simple stuff. Pretty simple how we create an object for a class and then use the properties and the methods inside of it to get what we want. So then make sure you save it and run it. And now in your console, you're going to see a prompt. It's going to say, what color is your bird supposed to be? Inside of the console, go ahead and type any color you want. I'm going to say dark cyan, which is also teal, but I'm going to say dark cyan for the hell of it. Hit enter. And then you should see another output that says your bird's color is, and then whatever you entered, dark cyan, or green, or blue, or red, or yellow, or whatever color you decided to assign to your bird. Pretty cool. Now there are other concepts with classes that we're going to cover in a later video. Next video we're going to cover what's called inheritance, and how you have a parent and a child class and how those connect with each other. I'm not going to explain too much here because, well, that's for the next video. And then we're also going to learn about interfaces and how you would use an interface. We're also going to learn about polymorphism, which is another concept that has to do with classes and inheritance and all that stuff. It's going to be a wild ride, but polymorphism and interfaces are a little bit further down the pipeline. But just know, learning about classes, learning about the basics of classes that we've done here isn't the end of what classes and object-oriented programming is capable of. So that basically does it for this video, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one. See ya.